It was only a matter of time before we uttered the words Final and Fantasy together. Final Fantasy has arrived on our list of the 100 greatest video games of all time. It is number 38, and we are specifically talking about Final Fantasy 3, but we are reserving the right to also talk about 7 and 12. This is basically our personal Final Fantasy greatest hits.
10's in there as well. There's a lot of different characters, and the stories are all kind of jangled and jumbled inside of my head. I can't remember any of this stuff. I remember loving 3, though, for the Super Nintendo the most.
Yes.
Probably because it was doing things I had never witnessed in video games up until that time, and frankly, since. I mean, I was having an opera sequence in the middle of this game going, this is cool. This is so different, and thankful for Japanese kind of perspective on crafting stories in games and making us care about these characters. And certainly 7, I think, represents a major milestone in video game history, because this was a game series where characters, what happens to them, affected people on an emotional level. And I've been to video games live. I've seen these Final Fantasy tracks played for thousands of people and seen the haunted looks and expressions and cheers and tears that come up when you play music that corresponds to these incredible memories and moments.
Who would be next?
I always used to laugh whenever Final Fantasy would come up at press conferences, whenever we'd go to these cons, and I'd see the airships, and I'd see emotions and the people crying and the people fighting these weird octopuses. And then I made a deal with John Tatey once in Tokyo a few years back where I promised him that I would play and finish Final Fantasy 12. And man, did that game ever get its hooks into me.
Game,
I really felt this connection with the main character in the game, Vaughn, and all of his friends, and as they explored the city of Rabanastre, and as we took our journeys, aboard those airships that once made me laugh. Now I take them a little more seriously than I once did. I just cannot believe that this team at Square Enix was able to pack so much life into one PlayStation 2 disc. I mean, this game is practically never ending. There's hundreds of hours of gameplay here. There's all kinds of different gambits that you can assign to your characters and your party as you move through the game. All kinds of enemies and lands to explore and shops to shop in and airships to ride around in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason we're up to 15. There's a reason why we talk about Final Fantasy almost with the same breaths and tones and repetition that we do sports games. These things have meaning for millions of people. There's a lot of content to explore. There's too much, and I think it's important to pick the best from this massive series. But even if you go back to Final Fantasy 1 and 2 and you can play these reimaginings on the iPad or your phone or whatever, they're still really solid. The idea of these turn-based battles with these magic systems that were constantly tweaked and tuned and never perfected, but always imaginatively kind of twisted, so new iterations felt a little bit fresh,
Well, one thing they're always known for is raising the bar on production values.
Yes, that too,
They've
for sure.
always pushed the hardware. They've always pushed their game designers to deliver something you hadn't seen before on any other system. And in fact, let's take a look back at our favorite Final Fantasy reviews.
We're back and we have a versus to end all versuses here, I think. Is that right?
Did you say versuses?
Versus-I?
He says versuses.
But this fits because it's The Legend of Zelda,
Right.
Twilight Princess going up against Final Fantasy 12.
The only other time
Two
we had
powerhouses.
a versus this significant is when we did Halo 2 versus Half-Life 2.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yep,
But
absolutely.
this one is probably even bigger than that one.
Yes, but I just think it's just the sheer amount of stuff in Final Fantasy 12 that kind of
So
elevates.
you're going to
the
give it to Final Fantasy
yeah,
12.
I think there's just too much eye candy in Final Fantasy 12.
I'm giving him a tie. Okay, well, audio,
No contest,
hands
of course.
down,
No
no contest.
No.
Final Fantasy's always had the greatest music
Awesome
in
music.
the video game industry.
I love how they subtly change it too, as you're going from area to area and it's fading to black, and then the new music just sort of silently creeps in, and it just permeates. It's beautiful.
I thought the voiceover work was pretty decent.
Pretty decent,
you know.
absolutely.
I'm afraid the jury's still out on that one.
Hands down, Final Fantasy wins on that
No
one.
question about that. Audio, Final Fantasy 12. Gameplay, how do these compare?
Final Fantasy 12, though, is different. It's the first time where they've ever had more of an action style
this was the most enjoyable Final Fantasy game that I've played since Final Fantasy III.
Oh.
No, Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo. This was a very fluid, very cool. Love the sweeping, universe that they created and the Star Wars.
Characters, not so much, though.
I liked them, man. I like the characters. I like the voice acting. I like this game a lot.
So Final Fantasy, we can't really say that we have loved all of the games in the series, but we sure love what this series has done for video games. And everybody has their own personal favorites. You're number 38 on our list.